We continue our series, The Good News of the Son of God, this morning in Mark 8. Now, I confess there won't be a whole lot of new sounding things this morning. In fact, much of what you'll hear in this passage sounds very familiar. There is a second feeding miracle. Jesus this time miraculously serves 4,000 people with 7 baskets of food left over. There is another confrontation with the Pharisees, and the disciples continue to lack understanding about who Jesus really is and what he's really doing. Now, these similarities, though, are not an obstacle to our time this morning. These similarities actually are partly the point. We should see these similarities. Now, that is not to say that we couldn't misread them. The feeding of the 4,000, for instance, is one that has been misread by critical scholars. Some critical scholars have argued that, surely this is just the same miracle that's being sort of explained in a different way. And surely the disciples would have seen this one coming if this were a second one. I mean, you go out to the place, right, and there's no food. Oh, wonder what we're going to do, right? However, their view of God is perhaps too small, and their view of the disciples too high. Perhaps they miss entirely the reason for the repetition. Perhaps they miss the theological point Mark is making. Mark wants us to see the depth of the misunderstanding of his disciples, of the crowd, and of the Pharisees. He wants us to see the danger of disbelief. Here, Mark is ending the first major portion of the gospel. If you break it up into thirds, then this would be sort of the end of the first third. Jesus, throughout this entire section, has repeatedly demonstrated his authority, yet he is continually met with disbelief, misunderstanding, and rejection from his immediate family, to his disciples, to the religious leaders, and to the very crowds for whom he was sent. Now, as Jesus continues ministering in a non-Jewish land this morning, he does find some level of receptivity, specifically when contrasted with his interaction with the Pharisees. But among his own people, he finds lack of understanding, lack of faith, much disbelief. Now, this will soon change, specifically with the disciples. I don't want to give away the suspense because I think preachers should be decent storytellers, but later in this passage, in this very chapter we'll consider next week, is a climactic moment that sort of ends this part of Mark's gospel for good, where Peter professes that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Christ. This confession mirrors one that will come later, that Jesus is the Son of God. But I want to make sure you understand where we are in the narrative. Jesus will soon give physical and spiritual sight in the next several verses, healing a blind man and then drawing out of Peter this pivotal confession, "Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Messiah." This morning, though, we reach the furthest point from Jerusalem and the darkest moment of disbelief yet, if you will. The rest of the narrative moves back to Jerusalem, for the King of the Jews is marching to his throne. Here, likely in the region of the Decapolis, we have something to learn this morning about the danger of disbelief. I think this text gives us 3 things that we need in our own battle with disbelief. First, we need reminded of God's heart. We need reminded of God's heart. Second, we need to check our own heart. We need to check our own heart. Third, and finally, we need spiritual understanding. We need spiritual understanding. So in our own battle with disbelief, we need reminded of God's heart, we need to check our own heart, and we need spiritual understanding. The title of this sermon is The Danger of Disbelief. We're in Mark 8. I'm going to read a big chunk of scripture, so let's zone in and hear the living word of God, verses 1 through 21. Here we go. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away." And his disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in the desolate place?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. They had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We need reminded of God's heart. This miracle obviously sounds quite similar to the one we considered a few weeks ago, but there are striking differences. In fact, the very similarities are meant to highlight the differences. You'll find in life a lot of times people who have the most in common fight the most with each other because the things they don't have in common are magnified to the nth degree. There are 4,000 people, not 5,000 people. Difference 1. Difference 2, there are 7 loaves and a few small fish this time, not 5 loaves and 2 fish. We got a little more to work with, you know what I'm saying? They've been out there for 3 days, so they have been out there longer, which I think is an interesting detail we'll get to in a moment. It's mostly a Gentile audience, so most of the people there, probably not everybody, but most of the people there would have been not Jews. They would have been Gentiles. And there are 7 baskets of food left over. Now, we can say a couple things just from that briefly of why this is a distinct miracle and why this is a significant miracle. First, many have drawn out the implication that 12 baskets being left over from the initial feeding indicates that Jesus completely provides for the 12 tribes of Israel, and that 7 baskets left over here indicate that Jesus completely cares for the 7 Gentile nations, or the people who were driven out of the promised land. In other words, Jesus cares for and provides for all people, both Jew and Gentile. I think that's true. One thing I want to note, though, is a difference that maybe isn't as highlighted as often, so I thought it would be helpful for us. The centrality of Jesus in this miracle as opposed to the last one. Now, obviously, he is central to the last miracle as the one who performs it, the one who cares for the crowds and who delivers all of the food through his disciples. So he is still the one doing all the work, and he is still the one that is supposed to be highlighted. But here, he does something that the disciples do, maybe honestly, maybe a little bit facetiously in the last one, or for their own reasons, right? But nonetheless, Jesus brings up the crowd's need to eat. The first thing he said to his disciples in this passage is that he has compassion on this crowd who has been with him for 3 days and are quite far from food. And if he sends them out on their own, they will surely faint. Now, we learn a few simple things with the centrality of Jesus. First, he's made himself available to non-Jewish people for 3 extended days. What's going on out there? We can only presume he's healing, he's teaching, he's doing these sorts of things. The second thing we learn is that Jesus really does love them. He is moved with compassion for a predominantly Jewish crowd, and here he is moved with compassion for a predominantly Gentile crowd. He tells the disciples, hey, we've been out here 3 days. These people are probably hungry. I know they're hungry, and if we send them out on their way, they're going to be faint on the journey. So let's get them something to eat. In love, he is meeting the spiritual needs of the crowd, and in love, he directs his disciples through his power to meet their physical needs as well. And I think we see something simple. He reminds his disciples of his compassionate care yet again. He asks the disciples how many loaves they have. This time they have 7. He takes them, gives thanks for them, blesses them, and multiplies them. He reminds his disciples that the one who has compassion also has the power to take the little bit they bring to the table and do abundantly more than they asked or imagined with it. So he reminds the disciples that God is loving, and he reminds the disciples that God is strong. He reminds the disciples that God cares, and he reminds the disciples that God can, if you will. Now, these are two reminders that I think you and I might need this morning. God cares and God can, right? That Jesus is compassionate and he is powerful. As the psalmist said, we know our loving God is strong. To avoid disbelief, we need reminded over and over again, even through miraculous ways, of God's love and care. You might say, how in the world could this miracle become dull? I mean, you see something like that once, it would change you forever. You would think, well, does your heart do the same thing when you read this story as it did when you read the last one? Are you as excited for this sermon as you would have been for the last one? You know, we tend to grow immune to things that we should not. To avoid disbelief, we need to frequently remind ourselves of things we already know. To avoid disbelief, to fight disbelief, we need to remind ourselves of things we think we already know. When life situations come that are dark, that block the light, so to speak, you need to draw strength from simple truths like the one we see in our passage this morning, that God is compassionate and God is strong. He cares for, provides for, and satisfies all who come to him by faith. I love a smaller point we could make. You know, the people who are out there, they're with Jesus for 3 days, and they're not even worried about what they're going to eat, you know? They're just so excited to be there. It's like a little kid at an amusement park. It's like, have you eaten? I don't know, what's food? You know, they're just going to all the things that have their attention. Like, they're completely enthralled by what's going on. Or, Jesus is out there teaching these people, leading these people, he's with these people, and they're just there for 3 days, and they're not going anywhere, right? And so I think we could say this morning that for those who find delight in Jesus, for those who find rest in Jesus, like, we can always trust it, even if we don't know where the help is coming from. The provision, that's the word I was looking for about 3 seconds. Even if we don't know where the provision is coming from, that Jesus provides for all who come to him and abide in him. Surely that includes you, and surely that includes me this morning. You might not know how he's going to take care of you, but this morning I just remind you of God's heart. As you wrestle with disbelief and the unique circumstances of your life, I remind you of something that you probably already know, but something you need to hear again this morning. Seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. For your God knows what you need before you even ask him. The one who clothes the lilies and provides for the sparrows surely cares for you. By faith, we need to see God's heart for the world. And my second point, we need to check our own hearts. Verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So Jesus comes back into the region where Pharisees may show up. The Pharisees are ready for him, and they clash with him. Now, many commentators note that the Greek language here is stronger and harsher than our English may seem. This is not a good faith encounter with some honest questions. This is a clash. They come demanding proof, demanding signs from Jesus. I'm reminded of this sentiment in 1 Corinthians 1. Paul says that Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and Gentiles, but the power of God to those who are being saved. So the Pharisees here, the religious leaders, they come and they confront Jesus. They're going to argue with Jesus. They're seeking a sign from heaven that will confirm Jesus' ministry. They want the skies to open up, and they want God to do something uniquely for them so that they can verify directly, since they have access to God that Jesus doesn't apparently. They want God to confirm to them that this Jesus is who he says he is. They want this to happen on their terms. We have questions for you, Jesus. If you are who you say you are, then you tell God to tell us. Now, this just might be my observation. It isn't worth that much, maybe like $2.50, but I think it's interesting that God has, if you're reading through Mark's gospel, God does this for us very early on. Not because we demand it in some sense, but in love and in grace, he confirms the ministry of Jesus at his baptism in chapter 1. Jesus comes up out of the water, the Spirit descends on him like a dove, and a voice from heaven came. You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased. Jesus has the affirmation of the Father. Whether or not he has the affirmation of the Father is not a question. However, you cannot make someone see what they refuse to see. You cannot reason with someone whose heart is hardened to spiritual things, about spiritual things. They are not coming to Christ by faith. They are coming to test him. Jesus' ministry began with this affirmation of the Father, and it has continued through the work of the Spirit, all demonstrating his unique identity and authority. If you want a summary of Mark's gospel to this point, maybe this is your first time here, it's not a bad summary. Jesus' ministry has begun with the affirmation of the Father, has continued through the work of the Spirit, and all he has done and taught demonstrate his unique authority and his unique identity. His healing, his provision, his miracles, all of these things are meant to show us that Jesus is the Christ. Christ just means appointed one, anointed one, Messiah, the King. He is who he says he is. But the Pharisees aren't interested in Jesus on his terms. They're interested in Jesus on their terms. And that is, I think, instructive for us this morning. Let me ask you a very simple question. What is your heart seeking in Jesus? What is your heart seeking in Jesus? Are you maybe calling him into your own courts and setting up similar tests for him? If you are truly God, then heal this sickness, save my marriage, convert my child, find me a better job, get me better friends. And if he then performs these things for you, then maybe you'll consider him. That is, if you're still interested, because you've gotten what you want from him. Friends, we need to check our own hearts. I want to ask two questions. How and why are we coming to Jesus? How and why? Let's note their approach. Let's note the Pharisees' approach. They came to argue and test him. They came to argue and test him. They are not seeking him. They are not bringing good faith doubts. They are not trying to understand him. They are opposing him. They are coming with hard hearts. How are we coming to Jesus? Let's note their approach. They came to test him. They're not seeking him. They're not trying to understand him. They are opposing him. Why are we coming to Jesus? Note their request. They want a sign from heaven. Why? Well, because they want him to pass their test. They want proof. Hear, friends, faith that demands proof is not faith at all. Well, what's a better way? Okay, what's a better way? If we shouldn't come like the Pharisees come, how should we do it? I think in general, in life, anyone can say what you should not do. Saying what you should do is a much harder journey. Anyone can tell you what church should not be like, but a positive vision of what church should be like often seems more elusive to folks. How should you come, you might ask? How should you come to Jesus this morning? If you're here maybe for the first time, if you're here for the 1,000th time, if you're here in whatever situation you find yourself, how should you come to Jesus? In one short sentence, here would be my answer: by faith as you are. By faith as you are. Come to Jesus by faith as you are. I trust that you are who you say you are, Jesus. I am willing to believe the revealed word of God. I am willing to say, you are the standard, I am not. You are going to tell me who you are, I'm not going to tell you who you need to be. The only way you can come to Jesus is also as you are right now. You come to him as you are, in the middle of whatever sin you're walking through, in the middle of whatever doubts you have, in the middle of whatever confusion and chaos may be around, or for many of you, in whatever just sort of normal, humdrum life you have sort of gotten into, right? You come to Jesus in the middle of that boring in the middle of that malaise, saying, listen, my life right now is a bunch of repetition and things that aren't very exciting. And so it's really hard for me to conceive of a relationship with a God who does such miraculous things when my life is so humdrum and normal. But in the middle of that humdrum malaise and normality, I come to you, Jesus, believing you are who you say you are and believing you're worth everything you say that you are worth. The point is just this. Come to Jesus by faith, letting him dictate the terms, and come to Jesus as you really are, for that's what he sees. He doesn't see the mask that I see. He doesn't see the front that other people see. He sees past all of those things to who you really are. So how should you come to Jesus? If it's the first time you've come to Jesus, you come by faith as you are. If you've been with Jesus for a long time, you still continue the same way you came. You didn't begin something by faith and his grace and then continue it by your performance and works. No matter what, you can never impress him. You continue the same way you started, by faith as you are. And why should you come? What compelling reason do we have to invite you to walk with Jesus Christ? Why should you come to Jesus? So why do they come? They come because they're demanding a sign. They're demanding that God do something for them. Why should you and I come? Well, here's the answer in one simple sentence: for his own sake. For his own sake. And here's why. God cannot give you anything better than himself. God cannot give you anything better than himself, for nothing like that exists. So we come to Jesus for who he is, and we come to Jesus for his own sake. He is better than any change you're asking for. He is better than anything in life. Now, this is not to say he will not make any material impact in your life, for that's not the case either. We know that he will change our lives. He will change our hearts. He will give us things we ask for, yes, but he will also change the things we ask for. He might not give us these things to give us these things. He might withhold this thing because he's doing this thing. I have no idea why he does the things he does, but still he does them. He will make a material impact in your life. In other words, if you come to Jesus on his terms and for his sake, he will make a material impact in your life. He will do things that you did not think were possible. Disbelief keeps us from seeing that. The title of this sermon is The Danger of Disbelief. Disbelief keeps us from coming to God by faith because disbelief says there's no way God really is better than this thing I'm asking for. Disbelief says God surely cannot work in my situation, for it is far too dark. Disbelief says, well, I can't manufacture this in my own power, so surely it's never going to change. Disbelief says, I read some of the Bible, but other parts of it don't make sense, so I'm not going to reckon with it and put my faith in it. Disbelief keeps us from coming to God by faith and from experiencing his presence and power. So what is Jesus' response to this? The text says Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. That's strong language. He is exasperated by their lack of faith. And I think subtly the perhaps saddest sentence here is a simple one that we just read over in the narrative. He left. Nothing more can be said. He leaves with his disciples. But we will soon see that he is hardly freed from the danger of disbelief. Third and finally, we must see that if we will not fall into the danger of disbelief, we need a spiritual perspective. We need spiritual understanding, our third point. We need to remember God's heart, we need to check our own heart, and we need to think spiritually. So Jesus gets into the boat with his disciples, and they head off to another location. I kind of wish there would be like a storm here just so we could have even more repetition, but I didn't write it. And you'll never guess what happened. They don't have enough bread. We have like 3 different bread metaphors going on at once here, so let's try to keep them close to our minds. They don't have enough bread. Imagine being the guy, this is just kind of like a step outside of it for just a second. Imagine being the disciple who was supposed to get the 7 baskets of bread. You got 7 baskets left over. That'll last you for a long time. You got a little trip here. There's no go marts or anything like that. We need to have a talk as well about go marts and sheets. I think sometimes in our culture here in West Virginia, we're sheets obsessed, but go mart was there for us when we were kids, and sheets is just a new kid on the block, and everyone forgets little go mart, but that's a whole other story. There's nowhere to stop and get some food, so you got these 7 baskets of food left over, and it would have been wonderful to have it, but let's say John, because he's the youngest probably, let's say John just forgot to get the bread. And so imagine you're on the boat and Peter, he's the loudest. He's like, man, I'm so glad we got this bread. Hey, John, where'd you put the bread? And John, oh man, I think I forgot the bread. So they don't have enough bread. Now, why is this detail mentioned? This detail is mentioned so it'll help us understand a disconnect that's about to happen. So Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's referring back to what just happened. He can caution them saying, watch out. So we know Jesus sighed deeply. He is exasperated by the lack of faith. There's a turning point. There's this coming to the end of himself with these Pharisees. Have you ever been with someone that just absolutely has you to the end of yourself? And he's talking to his disciples about it because he doesn't grumble and complain, which so many of us do in the name of concern or whatever. But I would say grumbling and complaining are 2 of the most toxic things you can do in your life. But that's a different sermon, if you will. He's working redemptively. He's saying, man, watch out, you disciples, you guys who are with me, the ones who came with me, you watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. What's he saying here? Different people have different ideas about what's the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. After all, the Pharisees and Herod they're 2 different parties, but I think they share a crucial similarity. They share disbelief. They share a rejection of the gospel. And that yeast of disbelief is what I think Jesus is telling them. That yeast of disbelief gets into the bread and it can rise, it can get in the middle of it and it can get worse and worse and worse. Disbelief rises. Disbelief spreads. One person's lack of faith spreads. That's why the best thing you can do for your local church is to care about Jesus. Because what you care about is contagious. Your attitude is contagious. Your approach is contagious. The hidden things about you right now are the things that are determining the health of our spiritual congregation. And so Jesus is saying, watch out for the danger of disbelief. It can spring up in you, disciple. You're close to me, you're with me, but you need to be careful because what you just saw from the Pharisees, you are capable of that. You are capable of rejecting me. And so how do they respond to this very serious rebuke? Well, John forgot the bread, right? Oh, we don't have any bread. That's a good sermon, but it's time for lunch. So there's this disconnect, right? There's been this big feeding miracle with bread. Then Jesus has this interaction with the Pharisees. Jesus identifies their disbelief as this leaven, which is dangerous. The disciples are hungry now. They're thinking about bread. And Jesus is teaching them about leaven, and all they say is, well, we don't have any bread. We actually had 7 baskets left over, but someone forgot them. Maybe TSA wouldn't let it on the plane. I've been watching a show called Contraband on HBO Max about airports. So you would be shocked at the things people try to bring into the country. That has nothing to do with anything. Jesus is teaching a spiritual truth. They are thinking physically. And Jesus, verses 17 to 21, is just a barrage of questions that get to the heart of the matter. Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Have you eyes but not see? Have you ears but not hear? Do you not remember? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 for the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets left over? The 4,000, the 7, how many left over? You don't understand. I'm not talking about real yeast. I'm not talking about physical bread. I'm talking about a heart of pride that lacks faith. But let's talk about bread if you want to talk about bread. I miraculously fed the crowds with 12 baskets of food left over. Then I fed 4,000 people with 7 baskets of food left over. Do you not understand? Is the question. Do you not see these signs? Do you do you have eyes but don't see? Do you have ears but don't hear? Do you not realize what I am showing you? We see something that is evident for us to see. That leaven is on the boat. The leaven of disbelief did not stay on the shore with the Pharisees. It followed Jesus right onto the boat with his disciples. Jesus is saying, you too, you don't see the signs that are right in front of you. Don't you remember I showed you, I'm like Moses in the wilderness providing manna from heaven for the people of God. I showed you that the bread I give is not just for the Jews, but it's also for the Gentiles. You've been with me the whole way. You've seen every miracle. You've seen I am the chosen king of Israel and the chosen one of God, but you're not seeing it. You're thinking about bread. You lack spiritual understanding. In this scene, the disciples are anxious about their lack of bread, but Jesus is concerned with their lack of faith. I'm finished, worship, if you want to start coming up, but no rush. They don't believe I'm finished, but many of you don't. The disciples are anxious about the lack of bread, but Jesus is concerned with their lack of faith. Friend, I think there's something here for you and for me this morning. Well, we can be so stuck in our own little world that we filter everything through that lens. We can think in the flesh, we can think physically, we can think about all the stuff that we see and all the stuff that surrounds us all the time. And we can be so obsessed with all of those things, we can completely and utterly neglect the things of God. We can lack spiritual understanding because we do not think with a heart of faith. But this is why we need the gospel. We need the gospel when we first become Christians, and we need the gospel for the whole Christian life. For in the gospel, Jesus confronts and overcomes your disbelief. In the gospel, Jesus confronts and overcomes my disbelief. In the gospel, Jesus confronts and overcomes our disbelief. He draws us in and rebukes us, not to shame us, but to heal us, to correct us, to put us on the right path. I said at the beginning of the sermon that this is like the darkest moment. Imagine the rejection well, not the darkest moment of Mark's gospel, but it's sort of like we've gone to the end, we've gone to the edge, we've gone to the Gentile lands, and we have also reached the pinnacle of disbelief. The Pharisees are out. They have come and they have rejected Jesus. They're asking him for a sign. Jesus says, surely no sign will be given to this generation. Oh, that language is that of a prophet. This wicked generation will not get what it wants, for this generation rejects the prophet of God. And to make matters worse, the people closest to him reject him. It hurts when people reject us. It hurts when people out there reject us. It hurts when you get snarky YouTube comments. It hurts but it really hurts when the people who are closest to you reject you. It hurts when the people who are walking with you reject you. It hurts when the people who are supposed to see it don't see it. And so here is Jesus on the boat. He's been rejected by the Pharisees. He's been rejected by the disciples. But back to Jerusalem, slowly we begin to walk. For Jesus will deal decisively with disbelief once and for all. And the tide is starting to turn. The disciples will soon see. The disciples will soon hear. For Jesus will enable them to do so. My challenge for you right now this morning is that you would allow Jesus this morning by his Spirit and through his word to fight the danger of disbelief in you. My prayer for you is that you would allow Jesus by his Spirit and ask Jesus by his Spirit through his word to fight the danger of disbelief in you as you remember God's heart, as you check your own heart, and as you think not with the eyes of the world, but as you think with the heart of faith. God, I trust that you love me, and I trust that you care. I trust that you're able, and I trust that you're powerful. Remind me why I'm coming to you. Remind me why I'm in this. Remind me what I'm looking for. And would you enable me to delight in you? Would you give us faith where we have disbelief? We're already praying, so let's just keep praying, right? Would you give us a heart of faith instead of a heart of disbelief? Would you make our hearts of stone hearts of flesh? Would you help us see and hear what is right in front of us that you intend for us to see and hear? I pray that right now you would fight with your word and through your Spirit the danger of disbelief in our midst, that the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees would not creep up in our midst, that we would not lose sight of who you are. We would not lose sight of your promises. We would not grow weary of doing good, trusting that in the right time, we will reap a harvest of fruitfulness. Empower us, God, by your Spirit. Help us remember your heart for us. Help us remember your heart for the world. Help us check our own heart and help us think with a mind of faith. In your name we pray. Amen.